Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à la programmation culturelle des Beaux-Arts de Paris. Nous avons le plaisir, l'honneur et le privilège de recevoir ce soir l'artiste William Kentridge et la conservatrice et commissaire Marie-Laure Bernadette qui vont dialoguer pendant 1 heure ce soir avec nous à l'invitation de la chaire Dessin extra large. Alors avant de vous donner la parole, je vais vous présenter brièvement chacun. William Kentridge est un artiste majeur sur la scène contemporaine artistique aujourd'hui. C'est un dessinateur, surtout et avant tout, mais aussi un sculpteur, un graveur, un cinéaste, un acteur et un metteur en scène, bien évidemment. Ses œuvres, qui sont très fortement ancrées dans la politique, la science, l'histoire et la littérature ont été montrées, présentées dans les plus grands musées, les galeries et les théâtres du monde entier depuis les années 90. Je ne vais pas citer toutes les institutions qui ont accueilli votre travail, mais évidemment il y a le MoMA à New York, le Louvre à Paris, le Reina Sofia de Madrid, le Kunstmuseum de Bâle, etc., etc. Vos œuvres ont aussi intégré les collections de toutes ces grandes institutions. Vous faites des productions d'opéra. Je vais en citer quelques-uns. Vous avez notamment monté La flûte enchantée de Mozart, Le nez de Shostakovich, Lulu et Wojciech. Aujourd'hui, c'est ce qui... D'ailleurs, Wojciech, vous êtes à Paris en ce moment même parce que vous signez la mise en scène de Wojciech à l'Opéra Bastille, qui aura lieu du 10 au 30 mars. Voilà, je ne vais pas être trop longue parce qu'on pourrait prendre 1 heure pour vous présenter, mais dire aussi que vous êtes récipiendaire d'un beaucoup de titres honorifiques et de prix. Vous avez reçu notamment le prix Premium Impérial en 2019, qui distingue chaque année les plus grands créateurs. Et puis, je préciserai juste aussi qu'en 2016, vous avez créé un projet, je crois, qui vous tient à cœur, à Johannesburg, qui est le Center for the Less Good ID, qui promeut les pratiques transdisciplinaires, collaboratives et qui soutient la jeune création notamment. Voilà, ce sera peut-être un sujet que vous allez explorer ensemble pendant cette heure, notamment avec vous, Marie-Laure Bernadette, qui est conservatrice générale honoraire du patrimoine, commissaire d'exposition aussi. Vous avez été conservatrice au musée Picasso, au CAPC de Bordeaux, au Centre Pompidou, vous étiez en charge du cabinet d'art graphique. Vous avez évidemment été en charge de l'art contemporain au musée du Louvre pendant de nombreuses années, et on vous doit de grandes expositions sur de grands artistes, sur Pablo Picasso, sur Louise Bourgeois, sur Jenny Holzer, sur Ravish Kapoor, et évidemment sur William Kentridge, dont vous connaissez très bien l'œuvre et le travail, puisque vous avez notamment orchestré en 2020 sa dernière grande exposition en France, au LAM, une exposition qui présentait une rétrospective de son œuvre, des premiers dessins des années 1980 aux récentes œuvres monumentales de l'artiste. Vous allez peut-être explorer d'ailleurs le lien entre ces premiers dessins et ces œuvres récentes, et puis surtout parler du rapport de William Kentridge au dessin, c'est ce qui nous réunit ici ce soir, de la place, de la pratique et de l'expression du dessin dans l'œuvre de William Kentridge. Voilà, c'est avec nous le récit d'une vie de dessin et du processus créatif de ce grand artiste. Voilà, je vous remercie encore vivement de votre présence ce soir, et puis je vais vous laisser la parole. Alors juste, je précise que ce dialogue aura lieu en français et en anglais. Et puis, dernière petite précision, je demande au public de garder votre masque, voilà, pendant cette heure de dialogue. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Barbara.
Je dis une chose. Moi, j'ai une grande envie à parler en français. Ma femme, elle me dit, s'il vous plaît, n'essayez pas à donner un discours en français. Elle dit, quand je parle français, je change, je gonfle, je me perds dans le grand voyelle français, le E, le A, le E. Et puis, je vais parler en anglais, ça sera plus sec, peut-être moins intéressant, mais enfin, quand je dois dire quelque chose de précis, je suis sûr que tous les mots français m'échappent. Okay.
Merci et bravo William. Enfin, je t'entends parler français, parce que tu refuses souvent alors que je sais que tu le parles. Bonjour, bonsoir. Merci beaucoup Barbara et l'École des Beaux-Arts pour cette invitation. Je suis très heureuse, honorée et un peu intimidée de faire cette conversation avec William, même si, comme Barbara l'a rappelé, on a eu l'occasion de se rencontrer au musée du Louvre, puis pendant cette grande rétrospective aux lames. Et évidemment, vous êtes l'artiste idéal pour parler de ce que vous appelez le dessin at large, puisqu'on va voir que le dessin, qui est le moteur principal de votre démarche, conduit et entraîne un petit peu toute votre activité. Mais avant d'aborder ce sujet, je ne peux pas m'empêcher de penser à la situation que nous vivons tous aujourd'hui, surtout nos amis, collègues, artistes ukrainiens et russes. Je me serais beaucoup réjouie de faire cette conversation et je m'en réjouis toujours, mais on a tous un peu le cœur lourd et on vit un peu sous cette chape de plomb du désordre du monde et du chaos. Donc j'avais envie de poser la question à William en introduction. Après, bien sûr, on va parler du dessin et de l'art et revenir à tout ce qui nous occupe aussi ici. Comment cette menace et cette invasion a été vue du point de vue de l'Afrique du Sud?
I change to English. I think one has to understand that what happens in Ukraine, without a doubt, it makes a different shadow across the studio, across all our activities. Not that we stop doing our activities, that we leave the studio, that we can't go on drawing, but that it makes us question every mark you make. Is the mark you are making adequate to the world in which we are living? And that's a question that arrives maybe at the beginning of the work in the studio, but as you will all know, once you are in the studio, those questions disappear, and then it's a question of the mark, the paper, the paint, the material, the impulse, the gesture. So it's both vital and also at the side of the work in the studio. But it's no doubt that the world will be different this week from how it was last week, and we're in a changed set of circumstances.
Merci William. Je vais aborder peut-être aussi un autre sujet, puisqu'on a parlé du studio et de l'atelier, que l'artiste est toujours enfermé, comme vous le dites, dans son studio, comme dans un cerveau. Avant ce drame qui nous touche tous aujourd'hui, on a vécu aussi un autre désordre, une autre chape de plomb qui était celle du confinement. Et je me demandais comment un artiste comme vous, qui voyageait partout, qui avait des centaines, j'exagère, d'expositions, de projets, qui bougeait tout le temps, avait vécu cet enfermement pendant quasiment 2 ans, surtout qu'on sait que l'Afrique du Sud est particulièrement touchée. Comment est-ce que vous avez vécu ça dans le studio? Est-ce que le dessin est devenu prioritaire?
Well, there's a paradox. For many people in the arts world, and for my colleagues who are dancers, who are musicians, who are performers, the lockdown, the conditions in South Africa, everywhere in the world, were catastrophic. Not just that people couldn't make an income because they couldn't work, but in many cases they couldn't even practice their métier. They weren't able to be in a studio. So I'm very aware how catastrophic it was. I'm very aware how terribly damaging and hard it was for all students who should be in contact, for whose student life is about social meeting, things outside the lecture hall as well as inside the lecture hall, how difficult it was. But having said that, for an artist who works in a studio, the 2 years of not leaving were fantastic. To have 18 months of not leaving the studio I had not had for 40 years. And to suddenly not be counting the days between journeys, but to know that week after week one could be working in the studio in a safe space was, so there is a paradox, because I'm aware how extremely hard it is for so many people.
Merci pour cette réponse. Alors revenons donc à votre formation, parce qu'en fait, si le dessin est le moteur principal de tout votre processus créatif, vous n'y êtes pas venu tout de suite. Vous avez commencé par un peu d'essayer le théâtre, la peinture ça ne marchait pas, un peu travaillé pour la télévision, un peu travaillé pour le théâtre. Vous dites en fait qu'il n'y a pas eu de révélation, mais plutôt une longue et douloureuse suite d'échecs. J'ai échoué à devenir peintre, j'ai échoué à devenir acteur et j'ai été réduit à dessiner. Est-ce que cette réduction est quelque chose de péjoratif?
It's not pejorative, but it's the truth. I think one can write one's biography in terms of being rescued by one's failures. The things that one is unable to do and you know that you are unable to do it. When I started as an art student, the way of being an art student was to paint with oil on canvas, and I just was not able to make sense of the medium. And it was only when I started making eau-forte, gravure, etchings, in which black and white is the natural medium, it was only then that I started to feel I could think in the material. When I was painting, I was always stuck with the question, does it look good? What is the look of it? And that's a terrible question for an artist to have to ask. It's much more, is the medium a material in which you can actually find your thoughts? And for me, there was something about the black and white, the limited palette, and later on with the actual material of charcoal and paper, that suddenly made me feel my hands could move and I could think. But there was a period when I thought I should be an actor. I came and spent a year in Paris at the École Jacques Lecoq, the wonderful theatre school that continues in Paris. But I discovered after 3 weeks I was not an actor. But I stayed on, and in fact, if I teach drawing now, which I do very occasionally, all the exercises I do with the young artists are exercises that I did 40 years ago in the theatre school. Things that have to understand what is the impulse of a gesture of a mark, where does it come from in the body? What is the energy you need at the start of a mark for it to reach the right point at the end? Exercises, physical exercises, because for me the drawing, the activity of drawing or being in the studio is primarily, it's a physical activity. It has to do with the extension, the arc that an arm draws. Are you drawing with your whole body? Does the whole body move as you draw? Are you just drawing from the shoulder? Are you drawing just from the elbow or just from the wrist? And are you just drawing with your knuckles? And quite often one starts a drawing with one's whole body. It's great and it's big, and then one becomes more and more cautious. So to say, do you need that cautiousness, or can you end the drawing still with your whole body? So the theatre school was very important, and it's in all the projects we do. Obviously, in the theatre projects that I do now, I still work with colleagues who were with me at the school 40 years ago. And after failing at the theatre, I thought I would then become a filmmaker, and that didn't work. And then I found I was back in the studio making drawings. When I started as a student, and maybe this is important for students here, I was working in a bit of theatre at university, and I was doing drawings, and I was doing academic work on politics. And a friend said to me, or many people said to me, you must focus on one thing. Either do drawing. If you want to do drawing, draw well. If you want to be in theatre, become an actor. If you want to study politics, become an academic. But if you do all of them, it will be, you'll never manage any. And for many years, I tried to follow that advice. So I stopped the studio, I tried to be an actor. Then I thought, I'm not an actor, I'm not an artist, I'll try to be a filmmaker. And only many years later, when I realized that my work was making drawings and making films from the drawings and putting those drawings into theatre, that I understood how I had to, in fact, resist and turn that advice on its head. So that's the thing about being careful about advice. So I give you no advice, apart from that.
Vous avez pu voir que même si vous pensiez être un mauvais acteur, vous êtes toujours un très très bon acteur. On vous voit d'ailleurs beaucoup maintenant dans vos films. Alors peut-être qu'on va aborder le médium le plus connu et ce qui est un peu votre caractéristique, ce que vous avez un peu inventé, ce qu'on a appelé les drawing for projection, que vous avez commencé qu'en 89. Et ensuite, vous en avez fait une dizaine. On va peut-être en montrer certains, parce que vous avez vraiment inventé un nouveau procédé avec le fusain essentiellement, avec l'effacement, les traces, avec une succession de dessins qui sont filmés par une caméra. Peut-être vous pouvez expliquer un peu ce processus qui est vraiment votre marque de fabrique et qu'on peut appeler quasiment un nouveau médium, parce qu'on n'est pas dans le dessin animé, il ne s'agit pas d'un dessin fixe, c'est-à-dire que vous faites parfois des dessins fixe, mais l'essentiel dans ces années 90, c'était les drawings for projection.
So maybe it's good we'll just show a minute extract so people know what we're talking about after that. I'm not sure if there is or isn't sound, if it will work. So this is an extract from a film made in 1990, so that's 30 years ago. It's a technique which I started working with around 1990, so I've been using it for 33 years. Every several years I make a film using this technique. Okay, that gives you a sense of it. So what Marie-Laure is referring to is the technique of making the films in which, you can see in those drawings at the top, instead of making thousands of different drawings as you might do in a traditional animation, there's a limited number of drawings, and the drawings are then altered in front of the camera. So there's a drawing on the wall, and halfway across the studio there's a camera, and I would shoot 2 frames of the drawing and then walk back from the camera back to the drawing and make an alteration to the drawing. So you can see in this drawing a figure, in this drawing the same figure, but I'd added the sheet of paper. And then I've erased the sheet of paper here and redrawn it in another place, and so on. So it's a series of successional drawings. If you look, you can also see the trace of the previous drawings that are there in the work. So in the end, there's one sheet of paper left, which in this case might be a body which has disappeared into the landscape. But there is on the sheet of paper the trace of all the erasures that have been there. And this, in fact, became the heart of the project. And it became a series of projects which are about memory and time. How does one hold on to a memory? Where does it live? What are the traces of it? And so that became a theme in the work. But what I want to explain, and this is an important thing for people at the beginning of being artists or students, is that I didn't know this at the beginning. At the beginning I wanted to have the drawing moving, and I tried to do a perfect erasure. And I tried all sorts of different kinds of gum and erasures to take away all the traces of the drawing, but failed at that. And so when I first showed people the drawing, the films, I would apologize for the mess, for the trace, for all of this messy grey over here. And only after people said to me, actually we like the messy grey, we like the trace of the mark, did I look at it differently and say, oh, okay, all right, well, let's keep it then. Let's not try to erase it perfectly. So what I'm saying is that it's not something I had an idea, how do I show time, how do I show the passage of memory or the disappearance of memory or the traces of history. That's what emerged from the medium itself. The medium itself was showing kind of both how it could be, but also what its deep themes would be. And I realized that's something that has interested me. One can think, and in terms of animation, I think one can say this, that, for example, we could think of this table here just as a table. Here's a wooden table. And that's a fact. So you can think about the world as fact. Here's a photograph or a drawing of the table, and that's the table. But you can also think of the table as a much damaged tree. You can think of the table backwards, from the table into the planks of wood, from the planks of wood into the tree that's been felled, from the tree that's felled back into the tree that's upright in the forest. And you can think forward with the table. You can say, well, here's the table. In due course, this is going to be carted out. It'll be cut up. It will be turned into firewood. There'll be the flames, the smoke, and the ashes. And that's also part of what is inside the table. And so with animation, which is a technique for transforming, starting with one drawing, allowing it to become something else, it was a good technique for a sensibility that liked the idea of provisionality, that things are as they are just for a moment. Everything is in a process of transition, that this table that looks so solid, in fact, has this trajectory through it. Histories which we think are so solid are much more fragile. One thought of Ukraine, here's an independent, solid country, that's the shape we've got in Europe for the next 50, 100 years, and in a week or in a month it can suddenly change from table into smoke and ashes in that process. So an idea of the world as provisional and our understanding of the world as a constructed provisionality also came in the work. So in that sense, charcoal and paper showed me a way what I was thinking. And it's also not at the beginning I thought, what should I use to make animation? It was the other way around. I was making charcoal drawings and thought, let me film a charcoal drawing while I make it and see what that looks like. And then discovered that this film could continue, the drawing could keep moving. So again, that was something which should have been a good idea, to think of the charcoal, but in fact it was not. It was there already. And I simply followed the material that was given.
C'est important, je crois que vous aviez dit que l'animation pour vous était un moyen d'avoir une perception du monde provisoire, parce que provisoire, cette incertitude, on la retrouve un peu dans tous vos questionnements. On a pas mal parlé de la technique, mais on peut peut-être aussi aborder les sujets, parce que les sujets de ces petits films, le premier qui est Johannesburg, la deuxième plus grande ville après Paris, ou Félix et Nelzaï qu'on vient de voir, bien sûr traite de la situation en Afrique du Sud, traite de l'apartheid, traite de la violence. On voit aussi beaucoup de paysages, les paysages autour de Johannesburg que vous connaissez bien, et on voit surtout deux personnages qui incarnent une forme de dualité, qui sont deux doubles de vous-même. So Eckstein, qui est un peu le monsieur capitaliste avec un costume rayé et un gros cigare, et un artiste, on pourrait dire, qui est toujours tout nu, qui est Félix Teitelbaum. Donc, est-ce que vous pouvez parler un petit peu de comment est venue la narration, parce que là aussi, on a vu, par exemple, les sujets, mais aussi votre façon d'associer. En fait, il n'y a jamais de récit continu, c'est toujours un récit discontinu. Et votre narration passe d'une association à l'autre, comme vous l'avez expliqué sur la table, d'une idée à l'autre. Voilà.
So I made the first film, as I said, in I think 1989, long before most of you were born, almost before your parents were born. And at the time, it was a testing of a camera which I'd been lent and the charcoal drawings, and I had no idea that I'd go on making these films for the next 30 years. So I didn't have any concern about what were the characters, what were they doing. It was just an exercise in the studio. But somehow I've been stuck with the same characters, like commedia dell'arte characters that perform different roles but are always the same characters in the films. And so the characters, the two alter egos in a way, are there to be a spine or a motor through which different ideas can be looked at. And the films were never made as a history of South Africa, but if you look back over them, almost all of them correspond to different moments in our history and different elements of Johannesburg life. So the first film that I showed you, in fact, was made in 1994, Felix, the film we've just seen. And that was a time of our first democratic election. Nelson Mandela had been released, we had our first election. And at the time of the election, there was huge civil violence. Many, many people were killed in the lead up to that election. It wasn't certain if we'd have a civil war or an election. And after the election, all of those people who died were kind of forgotten. And so in the film here, which was made at that time, all those bodies that disappear into the landscape corresponded to that era of our history. And the different films have had elements of where we are at the moment going through them. But they're allowed to move. The principle of the films and of the studio is that anything can fit in. It can be personal, it can be private, it can be political, it can refer to other events in the world that are happening at the time, and we'll see what it becomes. So the other thing about the films is that they're all made, none of them have a script or a storyboard. Usually with animation particularly, you start with a very exact storyboard. It's not like a documentary where you can shoot 50 hours of film and edit it down to 1 hour. It's so slow doing the animation that you want to use most of your material. So usually an animated film is very carefully planned in advance. But these are called drawings for projection because they're not made like a film. They're made as a series of drawings, and as the drawings are made, we see how they can fit together to try to make some kind of loose narrative, a trajectory. And so on the first day, what it means is that with filmmaking, you know, very often at first you have to write down your idea, then you have to write a treatment, then you have to go and find a producer or apply for a grant to make your film, then you have to change your proposal 20 times to fit in with what the grant or the producers want, and then maybe 18 months later you actually get to make your film. I wanted a film where the day I decided, let's start making a film, the film can be made. One can start that day, which is to say all I needed was a camera. It used to be a roll of film, now you could do it with, you can do it very beautifully just with a phone or with a camera like this, and a piece of paper. And you don't need to, your work is not dependent on other people's enthusiasm. You don't have to charm someone else about your idea. You can start working on it yourself. You also don't have to know what you're doing. You don't have to, because if someone says, well, please can you give me 20,000 euros to make my film? And they'll say, well, what is your film? You can't say, I don't have any idea. I just have the desire to make the film and I've got a piece of paper and can I have the money? And it'll be hard. Whereas if it's just you and your camera and your sheet of paper, you can say to yourself, I don't know what we're doing, but let's just try. And your other self will say, yes, that sounds very stupid to me, but let's just go ahead and see what happens. And so that was also very important, that I could find a form in which not knowing was safe, that the studio became a safe space for not knowing, for doubt, and for stupidity. I mean, to say, this is a very stupid idea, but let's see what it becomes. Give the image or the process the benefit of the doubt, and we'll see what it becomes.
Donc vous laissez beaucoup faire le hasard. Il y a une part de hasard.
Not so much as more than hasard, what I would call fortuna. Hasard is if you take all your phrases, you cut up a book, and you put all the words, all the sentences in a hat, and then you pull them out one by one, and that becomes your text. Like the I Ching, where you're just throwing the... It's different to that. You may cut up the text and then put the text on the table, but then it is to see what does the text suggest if you rearrange it, if you take these sentences down and change it there, if you move this image down and start with a different image, if you swap them around, if you cut them in half. And also if you add sound, what does it start to, what do you receive, what do you recognize in what you're making rather than what do you know? So it's about allowing a big space for recognition and understanding the limits of knowledge in advance.
Alors, ce qui est extraordinaire avec vous, c'est que cette animation du pauvre, comme vous l'expliquez, avec très peu de moyens, est devenue à la fois une espèce de théâtre personnel et un théâtre du monde. Comment est-ce que ce drawing for projection a pu vous conduire aux processions, des shadow processions, à la sculpture, au théâtre, à l'opéra? Comment, partant de cette base, vous avez agrandi, là on est vraiment dans du dessin extra large, vous avez agrandi votre perception du monde, parce que le dessin pour vous est la pensée, en dessinant vous pensez.
Yes, I want to just find, oh, I don't know how to stop that.
Oui, parce qu'on a la musique, vous avez dit qu'on introduisait la musique, donc tout se met en mouvement.
So, yeah, let's, no, I don't want that one. There. Yes. Okay, so this is a piece of theatre that was made. It has to load it down and then we'll see if it comes up. Yeah, so here you get a sense. It's a piece of theatre which was on a stage 50 meters long. It's about the history of the First World War in Africa. Okay, you get a sense of the scale of it. And it's a combination of drawings projected at the back and actors in the foreground, performing with playing with the scale of their shadows. Her shadow is the big shadow at the back. So it's using the stage as if it's part of a four-dimensional drawing in 4 dimensions. So you've got the projection, which is length and height, and it moves through time, and you've also got the depth of the stage. Sorry, this way around.
Je précise que c'est une commande qui a été faite pour le centenaire de la guerre de 14-18 et qui a été montrée pour la première fois à Londres à la tête galerie.
So these are some images of the making. So in my studio we would have a workshop, a gathering of actors, musicians, filmmaking, video projectors, and we'd start like a drawing, not knowing what we're doing, having an idea we're interested in the war, and start with sounds, with orders, with texts, with music. Different dances, different kinds, playing the mixture of costumes made out of paper, costumes which are designed for the scale of the shadows, large cutouts which are carried to throw the shadows on the wall, so famous portraits cut out of cardboard. We'll see if this shows just this will give a sense of the workshop, of the making. So there you see the size of the shadows cast in of the production. Okay. Okay, it finishes now. Okay. Okay.
Oui, ce magnifique spectacle nous permet d'aborder en effet plusieurs sujets, peut-être la politique, la conscience politique, puisqu'il y a quand même un lien, comme vous le dites, entre la Première Guerre mondiale et la colonisation, puisque ça traite en effet de tous les soldats africains qui sont morts. Ça va nous permettre aussi de parler de vos sources, puisque dans ce spectacle, il y a une hybridation de chants dada, de chants populaires. On retrouve, vous lisez, je crois, un poème de Schwitters ou de Haussmann, enfin, toutes vos sources, expressionnisme, dada, constructivisme. Et puis peut-être aussi aborder, puisqu'on le voit un peu ici, le thème de la migration, des défilés, de ces fameuses shadow processions avec des ombres qui ont été une constance de votre travail. Comment ces trois choses se combinent dans ce magnifique spectacle.
I mean, the project started, we thought we would just make a procession of different people going off to war. But we discovered that even if we walked very slowly, the procession would take 3 minutes across the stage, and we needed to fill that. So it became a series of many short scenes, many different scenes of manifestos from around the time of the First World War, which is both the time of the conflict, but also of the Dadaists in Zurich. So we had a mixture of Dadaism and of colonial history and of European high modernism in the music and of African local music. All of these things trying to discover what was the history we never knew, which is to say the history of the First World War in Africa. When I was growing up, the First World War was so much the images of Flanders and France and the trenches and All Quiet on the Western Front, and in Britain, the English war poets. And in fact, the war was in many other parts, in the Middle East and in Africa, where there were 1 million casualties in Africa in the First World War. And so this was a history that I didn't know, and none of the other participants in the workshop knew. And so the workshop, the period of making the piece, also was a period of discovering, researching and discovering our own history. And so that was very important, that we started with a very open-ended idea, and the idea was this long procession, a big stage, and shadows. We knew we were going to have shadows on the wall, and that was enough of a starting point. And then gradually it honed down into this history of the war in Africa we hadn't known. So in a way, the starting point, or the engine, which was the opposite of saying, this is something we know and we're going to teach someone else, the starting point was my anger and all of our frustration at not knowing a history we should have known. I mean, I'd studied colonial history, I'd read about their world. Why was it that I had got to the age of however old, 58, 60, and had been blind to this whole history that was there? So that's also one of the starting points, to not have to start with knowledge, but to start with something that spikes you, something that provokes you.
Excuse me.
Okay.
Okay. So
I can
go back to les silhouettes, les défilés.
Right.
Parce qu'on dit
yes, okay, the
il y a
procession.
plusieurs sources. Il y a bien sûr tous ces phénomènes des migrants qui portent sur leur dos,
Yes.
comme vous l'avez traité d'abord dans Shadow Procession, après dans Triomphe and Lament, cette grande installation que vous avez faite sur le quai du Tibre à Rome. Alors bien sûr, on peut l'interpréter aussi, c'est un souvenir des protestes et des manifestations auxquelles vous avez participé étudiant, mais c'est un thème qui est toujours d'actualité, puisque ça c'est migrant. Mais le phénomène des ombres, on a évidemment évoqué la caverne de Platon aussi. Pourquoi est-ce que ces ombres?
So in the central myth of Western civilization, of European civilization that has dominated us, was this one image that comes from Plato, from his Republic, which had to do with an image of people in a cave in darkness, seeing shadows on the wall. And Plato says, if these people were always locked in this darkness, they would think those shadows were the real world. But if you took them out of the cave into the world, they would understand that those were only shadows, and that there were other objects in the world, and that when they can look at the sun, then they would have proper knowledge. And from this comes the central metaphor of darkness being ignorance, and light being enlightenment, le siècle de lumière. Was that right? Yeah. And that, if one thinks of the defenders of colonialism, was very much that. The metaphors used, we're going to bring enlightenment, we are going to bring light to the dark continent, we're going to take people out of darkness. And I was always interested that for that metaphor to exist, Plato had to have this imagined group of people carrying these objects, and we'd see the shadows of the objects. And I thought, well, who are those people that have to, all of history, be endlessly carrying these objects in order for this allegory to work? And so there has been a lot of projects over the years of shadows and of processions. This piece, which we can just look at briefly, was a procession in Rome. It was drawn on the walls. It's a kind of a big piece of graffiti. You can see part of the wall is dark and part of the wall is light. Now the whole wall was, let's see if we get an image. Yeah. You can see the wall is very dark, and then we would cut a stencil of the shape we want to draw, and we would wash the wall around the stencil. So when the stencil was removed, you would see the dark shape against a light background. So here you can see the process of, I don't want that. And here again, the stencil on the wall. This will show the making of it, just to. So there's a stencil, so there are charcoal drawings, there are ink drawings. Here are the drawings which are being scanned, and then those are cut out of, a plastic stencil is cut out. The stencil is placed against the wall, and then the wall is washed around the stencil. And then the stencil is removed. So the image is made by when the stencil is removed, by that. And so all that's done, the piece is made only using water, just washing the wall. And after several years, the wall gets dark again and the image disappears. So it's a little bit like the table. It's there, it seems solid, but in this case, over 5 years, the wall got dark again with bacteria and dirt, and the image disappeared. So there's no longer the images on the wall.
Et le thème était donc les triomphes et les catastrophes, les désastres de toute l'histoire de l'Italie. Hein,
it was, I mean, it uses, the piece is called Triumphs and Laments. And it has as its principle that everybody's triumph, when you have a military triumph, it's always a disaster for someone else. And in Rome, in classical Rome, there was this tradition of triumphs. You would be given a triumph if you were a general and you'd succeeded in defeating an enemy, and you would bring back the slaves, and then you would be paraded in glory in Rome. Someone would hold a laurel wreath over your head, and that would be your triumph. But we understand that for everybody's triumph, it was only possible if there were other people who were destroyed by it, for whom it was a lament. And so it was putting together images that were heroic from Roman history and images that were shameful. And that sense of understanding our histories as both of those, containing both things we can be proud of and things which are deeply shameful, was an image behind it. At the same time that the great glories of the Renaissance were being made, and St. Peter's Basilica was being constructed in Rome, and Michelangelo was painting and Raphael was painting, at the same time they established the Jewish ghetto in Rome, in which Jews were confined into the ghetto and rights taken away, and there was a general humiliation. And I'd known about the ghetto and I'd known about St. Peter's, but I'd never put the two together. And in fact there's a connection. It had to do with Luther and the Reformation and the opposition to the building of St. Peter's. There was a complicated link between them. But it's about that kind of ignorance. That was my frustration at my own ignorance that provoked that piece also.
En fait, pour vous, l'histoire est toujours vue par fragments.
I mean, I think it is fragments, but it's fragments which we construct into a possible coherence. So here, this was asking, sorry, about the procession. In addition to making the drawing on the wall to celebrate the opening, we had a big musical procession in front of the wall, again with shadows cast on the wall. I'm just trying to see if we have a... Is there any video here? We'll just watch a minute of this, we can see. Oh, no, it's the same thing. Okay, you can keep it.
Avant d'arriver à l'opéra, peut-être, puisqu'on va progressivement sur des choses de plus en plus grandes, je voulais peut-être revenir un peu sur le dessin et l'importance de la ligne. Parce que j'étais très frappée quand je vous ai vu dessiner sur le mur pour la pièce Untitled Chapter aux lames. Il y avait deux grands murs et vous avez pris un fusain et vous avez marché en traçant comme ça un trait. Et on ne savait absolument pas où allait le trait, ce que vous avez dessiné. Certes, on a reconnu des motifs qui vous sont familiers, comme le chat, le téléphone, la bombe, et bien sûr Ubu, puisque ça a été Ubu. Mais j'étais très frappée parce que ça m'a fait penser à un film de Picasso où on le voit dessiné sur la chapelle à Valoris de la guerre et la paix. Et en fait, c'est pareil, il y a un trait, on ne sait pas où va aller ce trait. Et vous avez une très jolie phrase qui est en même temps un petit peu péjorative, disant que la ligne du dessin vous traîne comme un chien, comme si vous étiez guidé par la ligne. Que
so it was Paul Klee who said the famous line, "To draw is to take a line for a walk." But the question I had is, are you leading the line, or is the line like a dog ahead of you that pulls you along around this corner and up around that corner to allow that openness of the line? It's not to say the line is not connected to you, but it is trusting in your shoulder, in your memory, in the gesture that will find a coherence rather than thinking clearly, I must turn left, now I must go down a bit, now 2 centimeters to the right, but allowing something in between your head, your arm and your shoulder to find the mark.
On peut peut-être parler aussi de votre rapport au temps, puisqu'il y avait aussi au LAM une œuvre très importante, The Refusal of Time, The Refusal Hour, puisque là on parle de l'histoire. Le temps, la mémoire, l'effacement est quelque chose de très présent dans votre travail. En même temps, il ne s'agit pas vraiment d'une nostalgie, plutôt d'un anachronisme. Et paradoxalement, vous dites aussi que quand vous revenez en arrière, puisque vos sources essentielles sont l'avant-garde du début du siècle, que pour vous c'est toujours revenir à Dada, l'avant-garde, le constructivisme, que pour vous c'est vraiment ces utopies artistiques et révolutionnaires sont une source constante. Alors est-ce que c'est anachronique? Est-ce que c'est un retour nostalgique? On voit aussi dans votre travail des mégaphones, des vieux téléphones, souvent des appareils technologiques un peu dépassés. Alors, comment vous situez-vous dans cette ambivalence contemporaine et regarder en arrière?
I do use a lot of images from old technologies, megaphones, telephones. So, of course, I believe that there is a good nostalgia and a bad nostalgia. I think that a dangerous nostalgia is when you try to return to what was there before. To imagine one could now use an old-fashioned telephone or all of those old techniques and machineries. But there is something in old technologies, in mechanical technologies, in which one can see a process at work, as opposed to a digital or an electronic technology where that is invisible. And so in the one you are aware of the activity and the mechanism of how the world works, and the other you have to take on trust. You can't see how your cell phone is working, we just trust that it does work. But we're also aware how easily it can be switched off because we can't manage it ourselves. We're a more mechanical world, we can see the logic. And it's not to say that one wants to make a mechanical world, but for example, if you think of all the lines of communication we have now in the 21st century, of cell phone lines, of emails, of WhatsApp, of Instagram, of all these different things, as opposed to before, when one might have had a telephone conversation, and for the telephone conversation you'd have to take a wire and physically connect it to another person, and in this old switchboards you would see all these lines that connected physically one point of communication with that telephone. So there's something in that, even though it's an old switchboard, but that image of all those lines connecting, which in fact is a very accurate drawing of how the world is now. So that's, I think, the interest in some of those old technologies.
Et comment vous êtes venu donc à l'opéra? Comment est-ce que le dessin a pu rencontrer, se marier avec des livrets, avec une musique, et comment cette mise en scène est arrivée?
Well, I'd been working in theatre, mainly with a company of marionettes, a puppet company, and more music started to come into the performances, both live and recorded. And then we decided, or we were invited by a festival to do a chamber opera, small group of musicians and a few puppeteers. And after that, a larger opera house invited me to direct an opera. And one can think of it in two ways. You can think that you're the director of the opera, so you're simply the person that the opera has hired. They've got this huge machinery. That's the opera they want to do. And they've hired a singer, they've hired all the different people, the chorus, the orchestra, and you're simply there employed to direct the opera. Which is most probably the accurate way of understanding it. I prefer to think of it in a different way, that the opera comes to me and says, we're going to give you a canvas which is 17 meters wide by 10 meters high and 12 meters deep, and here for 3 hours you can make this drawing. And not only that, we're going to give you 80 members of an orchestra to play for you, and we'll give you 60 chorus members and the best singers in the world. And here's some of the greatest music written, and all of this becomes a kind of a gift to an artist to say, this is the material, this is the space in which to work. Which are the designers, the other directors, the other people you want to work with? And within that construct the opera. So it's a wonderful gift to be given, to be invited to do the opera. When I was 15, I wanted to be a conductor of operas. But then somebody said, you understand, to be a conductor, you have to be able to read music. And I said, oh, really? Okay, let's take that off the agenda then. So directing opera is as close as I can get to conducting, which I will never do.
Est-ce qu'on peut aborder donc ce qu'on a évoqué, ce que vous avez créé il y a quelques années dans le centre de Johannesburg, ce Center for Less Good Ideas? On retrouve vos idées un peu d'échec et de... comment est-ce que vous invitez donc des artistes pluridisciplinaires?
So the Center for the Less Good Idea, le Centre pour l'idée moins bien. Yes, not mauvaise, moins bien. Moins brave, c'est pas le même. The name comes from a proverb from Africa, from Botswana. And the proverb says, if the good doctor can't cure you, find the less good doctor. And for me, that's also, so it's both about the process of working. Sometimes one starts a project with a good idea, the first idea. And as you start working, in fact, the idea gets you're less confident in the idea. But there are many things at the side, at the periphery, that start to emerge, improvisations, new thoughts. And so this is to allow those new thoughts to come into the center and have a stronger place, the less good ideas, the secondary ideas. And it's both about a technique of working, of being open to what arrives in the studio, whether it's a music studio, a dance studio. And the center in Johannesburg is a physical space where we bring artists and dancers and actors and musicians together to make different short pieces. So it's both about that, how one can work in a studio, but it also obviously has to do with the kind of, there's a politics in it. When one thinks of all the grand ideas, the grand political ideas, how calamitous almost all of those have been. And so it makes a claim for more local, more particular, less gigantic ideas as a way of working in the world. So it has both of these elements, but it's a test. The center is a test of this proposition. If after we've been going for 6 years now, if in the end we say, actually, this is a very bad way to make art, everything that's come out of it is really bad, but in fact, our experience has that there have been several things that have been not good, as you can imagine. but there have been some remarkable pieces which have come through the center which would not have come. I mean, like the head and the load didn't come out of the center, but it came from those processes, and many of the performers had done work at the center. And that's ongoing, that's ongoing. It's physically located right in quite a rough part of Johannesburg downtown, where I have a studio. And in the 5 years we've gone, I think there have been over 500 performers, artists, writers that have worked there and done work there.
Il y a un dernier domaine qu'on n'a pas abordé, parce que c'est tellement riche et vaste, difficile, celui du livre, de l'écriture, des mots, parce qu'on trouve presque dans toutes vos expositions des espèces de maximes ou de phrases écrites et affichées. La plupart de vos projections sont souvent sur des livres, soit des livres de contes, soit des vieux livres. Est-ce que c'est quelque chose donc, qui vient peut-être de votre culture juive? Vous dites souvent que ça peut avoir un rapport avec vos origines. Ou est-ce que aussi c'est un intérêt pour l'écrit, la littérature, la force des mots?
Okay, I'm hoping to. Here we go. Okay. So the words are important. I'm not a writer. I'm not a novelist. I can't write a story. So I work very much by finding texts, and so I write like a scavenger. I'd read text, and if a phrase strikes me, I'd write it in a book or a notebook of phrases, of sentences that seem appropriate. And sometimes these become works in themselves. They get yeah. So things like God's opinion, words like this. So it's a mixture of the particular blue. This is a fantastic lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, the watercolor. And I needed to do something with this beautiful color I had been given, but I'm not a painter. So I thought we'd use it for these texts. So there were many pages of these painted phrases that come from different places. So they work both as something to read and something to look at as a drawing. But they need to work where they're at the edge of meaning. You can almost know what they mean, but you can't be. They're like a riddle that doesn't quite have a solution, where you can almost imagine what they could be. There we go. So things like Star of the... So some of them are stand-in for larger thoughts that are contained inside it, like Star of the Algorithm. Some of them have been used in theatre projects or in films and then have another life as texts. And then there are a lot of books in which, like that, in which the text is printed on top of an existing text. So you have a sense of one kind of knowledge and there's a new one on top. But the truth is that those book works started because of the quality of the paper of old books. There's some old books that have got a wonderful old tooth. Paper that was made before 1840 is fantastic to draw on. And so some of them were about how they would hold charcoal. Some later papers, like the paper they would use for printing encyclopedias, was very beautiful because of how it absorbed the ink or didn't absorb the ink. And so there's always a mixture between the material and the theme that has to go together.
And may I ask you a last question, because we are quite finished. The last question. Sur quoi vous travaillez en ce moment et quel va être votre nouveau projet, puisque vous avez dit que vous avez travaillé bien pendant 2 ans dans l'atelier. Alors peut-être plein de projets en même temps, comme toujours.
No, there was a big lock, because we were locked down, and so I could just be in the studio. I have a small studio in the garden and a larger studio downtown, so we were confined to the small studio, and for many weeks I just had one assistant who lives at the studio and so could be in the same bubble. We started working. It's a series of 9 films of life in the studio. So the principle is it's all only filmed in the studio, nothing outside the studio, and different themes are looked at. Each film is 40 minutes long, so it's like 6 hours of film, and it's not yet finished, but it's close to being finished. So it looks at the pandemic, at how the studio works, and at different themes in the studio. So it's not a documentary, but it's not a narrative. It doesn't have a form. So it's going to be very difficult to persuade anyone to show it. But there have been interesting films to work on.
Et vous vous prenez souvent dans le studio comme propre modèle. Vous avez inventé un autre rapport de l'artiste et le modèle. Vous êtes et l'artiste et le modèle souvent.
Yes, yes. So if it's just me and a camera, then I don't mind acting the fool, because I can just switch on the camera and I can do a performance and it's done. One of the things in these films and in the studio is the conversation one has with oneself. So usually, of course, that's an internal conversation. You'll all be familiar if you've worked on a drawing or a painting. You're at the painting and you're working on it, or you're making your drawing or your sculpture, and one's involved and you understand what you're doing. And then you take one step back, or you take 4 steps back, and you look at it, and you're a different person, and you're critical of what the other stupid self has done. And you say, how could you think that that's okay? That shoulder, you know, drawing someone like this. Come on, push that shoulder down. Let the hand not look like bananas, but look. And then the other person has to go back to the front and try to draw it and create it and fix it up. And then you take 2 steps back, and your other self is there again saying, no, that's not what I meant, that still looks worse. It was better 5 minutes ago. You should have left it. So that conversation is what a conversation that I'm sure every artist or every writer, everybody who can step back and see what they've done. Not so much, luckily, a dancer or a musician where they're in the moment and they can't be outside it also. And so a lot of the conversations in the films are those conversations. But it's also a conversation which wants to explore and say, one thinks of the self as a single thing, but in fact the self is always a construction. Every day we do this huge job of constructing who we are. Sometimes we're aware of, let's gather our strength and face the world and put on a smile even though I'm feeling terrible, so you know you're putting on different parts of yourself. But other times you're unaware that you're taking this sentence from what your father used to say, and that gesture from someone else you've seen, and this thought that you read somewhere else, and they get seamlessly, the collage is made inside you. And so what the films and the work in the studio does is make this collage, which is so evident in the studio, a way of demonstrating the collage that is how we understand the world and how we understand history and who we are. So the studio becomes a machine for demonstrating things that otherwise would be invisible.
Je crois qu'on a bientôt fini, mon cher William. Okay. Je voulais vous remercier infiniment parce que dès qu'on voit votre œuvre, vous nous faites penser, vous nous enchantez, vous avez un regard sur le monde, vous nous emportez dans votre imaginaire. Et c'est toujours un plaisir de découvrir votre travail. Merci beaucoup d'être venu.
Merci. Merci à tous.